Hello, everybody. Welcome to edition number 2 of my ongoing discussion with the incredible Dr. Melvin Morse. Now, many of you will have watched yesterday's discussion, and we believed straight away that there were so many issues that we wanted to talk about that we felt that we really needed to spend a little bit more time. Now, this will be very much under the standard practice of my in-con idea, which is basically two old friends chatting over a couple of beers. So this will be very informal and very chatty. And as we were discussing just before, Melvin and I are virtually the same age. So we have the same memories and the same, at least chronological backgrounds, at least. And what we're going to do with this discussion is there's certain bees we both have in our bonnets, which seems to bounce us up and down. So we're going to go straight in on this. Yeah. And the point I was making before was just about the way in which people like ourselves, we are stuck, we're in the middle of we're in a bridge, and we're trying to bridge spirituality and science. And everybody seems to throw stones at us. Yeah. Nobody likes what we're doing. So putting that over to you, Melvin. Yeah,
well, that's what you're saying is so dear to my heart, because I'm convinced it's because the debate is the 19th century science debating the 17th century philosophy. And people have, I think, on both sides of of what to me is a false debate. They buy into this idea that there's a body, there's sort of the machine, and then there's this spirit, this sort of the ghost in the machine. So, so that's sort of the out-of-body experience, sort of the body, the soul is this gaseous vapor that, since it's immaterial, but that doesn't mean it's invisible. It just means it's slightly visible. So this is what so then, when I come and I talk about the scientific aspects of near-death experiences and spirituality, and I point out that our brain is a spiritual brain, then people who are spiritually oriented become offended by this, because they think that that's reductionistic. They think that that's saying, oh, so you're saying it's just in our brain. You're saying that, that it's just made up by our, right temporal lobe, or what have you. And then meanwhile, the scientists who should know better, and I think frankly, do know better, as you pointed out, if you can talk to them late at night after a few beers, they think that the only way to conceptualize the spirit is this sort of ghost. And there's a whole industry, this is the whole Deepak Chopra, Michael Shermer industry, that they give the same lecture over and over and over again. And yet none of it matches today's science, or frankly, either today's spirituality or the spirituality of the masters of consciousness, the ancient Tibetan Buddhists, the people that meditated, 12, 14, 16 hours a day for hundreds and thousands of years. The conclusions that they reached are strikingly similar to the ones that you and I have. I'm not sure I've reached any conclusions, but the ones that I'm sort of groping towards. Every time I find something new, I find that the ancient Tibetan Buddhists had already thought of it, 1,500 years ago. But none of it has to do with some sort of spirit that lives in the body.
This is it, isn't it? We seem to have this hangover from the Cartesian dualist model of René Descartes, don't we? And then we have the kind of the two sides. Then, of course, we have, you mentioned The Ghost in the Machine, of course, that very famous book by Gilbert Ryle on the philosophy of the ghost in the machine. And of course, both you and I, for better definitions, we're non-dualists. We're very much taking the approach of the Tibetan Buddhists. And as you rightly say, it astonishes me. The more I read of Buddhism, the more I think, my God, these guys got it. But it's the same. It's not just Buddhism. I wrote a book a few years ago called The Infinite Mind Field. And I was discussing there the philosophy and history of the beliefs of the role of the pineal gland as a processor of reality, Yes. Now, you're quite right. What is happening is that there is this war between the people who believe that kind of spirit is, as you say, this amorphous nothing. And then there is the materialist reductionists like Daniel Dennett and the Churchlands and various other people who are saying, no, it's all physical. Everything is consciousness is an epiphenomenon of brain states. Now, it's more complex than that, because I think both you and I agree that at the base level, everything is data, everything is information, everything is holographic in nature. We are a singularity. And in terms, I'm always very interested in the Bill Hicks, the American comedian statement, we are one consciousness experiencing itself subjectively. And I believe, and your book, Where God Lives, the only way you can say it is where God lives. But what you're actually saying in this book is a profound non-dualist statement about what God is. God is within. God is every God. God is everything.
Yeah.
I contributed a chapter a few years ago to a book on pandeism, not pantheism, but pandeism, the idea that everything is mind.
Yeah.
And everything is created from mind. And as you rightly say, the science is proving
Anthony,
it.
that is the cutting edge of neuroscience today. I mean, that you've summarized in one sentence what David Eagleman, who I think is one of the foremost neuroscientists of our generation, of his generation. He's not of our generation, but that everything is mind and everything is created by the mind. And so when people say, well, the near-death experience is created by the mind, as if they're dismissing it or trivializing it, they're missing the point entirely. But unfortunately, this dualism is so ingrained that when I come back and I say, but everything is created by the mind, then they see that as a dismissive or trivializing statement. Whereas, in fact, if you look at Eagleman's research, which is so mainstream that PBS had a 6-part series on it, that the mind creates a mental model of reality, that's all we're doing, that your mental model of reality is somewhat like mine because we have similar brains. You may see the color red somewhat similar to the way I see the color red, but mostly it's because our mothers, and fathers, when we were 3 years old, kept telling us over and over again, this is red, this is red, this is red, this is red. And it takes a long time to learn what is the color red and for us to all merge our mental model so that we all agree on the color red. So why should it surprise anybody that we have such divergent ideas of what is God? And what is this comfort that comes to us when we die that helps us to facilitate the dying process? That everybody has a different idea of it. Well, because we haven't spent, months and months and months over and over again identifying the same set of information, the information that's the color red, for example, but in this case, the information that corresponds to a spiritual entity, and we haven't mutually defined it.
Well, this is it, isn't it? I mean, it's one of the things in one of my earlier books. I was particularly interested in qualia and the role of qualia, and was trying to explain to my readers what I meant by qualia. And I used the example. I said, imagine that you and I are sitting in the dark and we're watching the film Schindler's List. Now, in Schindler's List, as you recall, in Schindler's List, the film is black and white all the way through, with the exception of one sequence, which is a little girl in a red dress. And I don't you recall, but you see the little girl walking in a street in Amsterdam or somewhere, I'm not sure where it is. Then you see a scene later on in the film of a load of bodies stacked high, and inside the bodies is this little red dress or this little red coat. And you realize that's the little girl. Now, I said to my audience, and I said, imagine the scenario here. Where exactly is that red? Now, is the red in the original dress the child was wearing? Is it in the film, the filming that originally took place in color? It was then washed out to be red. The red then is converted into an electromagnetic signal, which is turned into a videotape or a film. That film is then converted into celluloid. The light then comes through the celluloid, and there's red tinting in there, which goes through the celluloid, which is then projected onto a screen. The screen then gives off photons of light at a particular wavelength, the electromagnetic spectrum, a wavelength that stimulates the eye at a particular type. That stimulates then, the light then enters the pupil of the eye, goes through the aqueous humor, and all the time, the actual photons are being converted. They're not the same photon as they go through the aqueous humor, as we know how signals are transferred electromagnetically. Then it hits the retina, and when it hits the retina itself is postage stamped and inverted. It is then converted into an electrical signal that then goes to the darkest part of the brain, the visual cortex at the back of the brain, and it's reprocessed again into an image of red that is then presented to the homunculus in the mind, which is the consciousness that's supposedly somewhere in the mind. But red is nowhere. The red is nowhere. The red is literally our interpretation of a particular vibrationary state of electromagnetic energy. And it's the same for everything, isn't it? Every single thing we perceive is modeled by the brain internally, you know?
Okay. So let's cut to the chase then. And I want to challenge the person who's listening to this, to your viewers. If you really understand what Anthony's saying, do you realize then that when people say to me, does something really leave the body when we die? To me, that's a nonsensical statement. There's no body to leave. There's no place to go. Well, so then people, so you don't believe that I had a near-death experience then. So you don't believe that I was out of my body. You didn't believe I had an out-of-body experience. Actually, I did the grounding research, which proves that near-death experiences are real. But I understand what Anthony is saying. And by understanding what modern neuroscience tells us, this is a mental model that we've created. So we simply create another mental model to struggle to try to understand what is happening when we die. We've created another mental model in which we, visualize or conceptualize our spirit as being outside of our body. And yet, that's yet another mental model, though. That's, and Pin von Lummel, if he was joining us on this show right now, he would say, this is why I don't like models. Because anytime that we create a model, we're limiting the experience. But I think that we can't understand the experience unless we understand that it is, in fact, a mental model. And that's all it is. And so that means that it is real. It's just as real as every other experience. And interestingly enough, this whole idea that our mental model right now is that we're sort of like a little tiny person inside our head, and we're looking out with eyes. That's not the mental model that all human beings have. There's human beings, in primitive cultures and such as that, that already have the mental model of being outside of their physical body. And, and these are cultures which are usually very intensely interested in directions and being able to localize themselves in space. And, just as when we say to each other, well, how are you feeling? These cultures might say, what direction are you oriented towards? And those cultures have the perception that they're sort of out of their body. And I heard a National Public Radio interview with a woman who went to study one of these cultures. And she said that after 3 or 4 months, she then flipped and started to share their mental model of, and no longer saw herself as visualizing the world from sort of behind the eyes, the way most of us do, but instead started to visualize herself almost like a little dot, following, like a little GPS signal, following herself around. And Eagleman's work supports this. He shows that he can have people wear glasses, which invert the visual image. And after a week or so, they start to see the world the way we see it again, ordinarily. Their mind has just shifted and just corrected, so to speak, this inverted mental model of reality.
Well, it's always the issue, isn't it, of the subjectivity. I mean, again, in one of my books, I say to somebody, we have a worldview. And we have the idea that we are somehow located somewhere around about 6 or 7 inches behind our eyes.
Yes, right.
That's an illusion, in that if you had your ears and eyes on your kneecap, you would feel you were located in your kneecap. So the feeling of location is an illusion created by how our senses process information. But it's more complex than that, isn't it? Because when we talk about quantum mechanics, when we talk about Einsteinian physics, for instance, we then get to the problem of time and space. What exactly is space? Space is empty. Now, as Ernst Mach argued, that if you had a space that did not have any objects in it, that space would disappear. And we also know that time and space are interchangeable, that space becomes time and time becomes space, and that time itself becomes infinite when you're traveling at the speed of light. And then I've used the analogy, and I've said, and people say to people, think about this for a second. It means that the whole visual world that you see is dependent upon photons, subatomic bosons, the carriers of the electromagnetic signal. Photons themselves can only ever travel at the speed of light and are point particles. So it means our own visual world is dependent upon objects that from their own point of view are timeless. So a photon leaving the Andromeda galaxy is, when it hits your eye, it's exactly the same. As far as the photon is concerned, it's instantaneous.
Yes.
Now, then on top of that, we then have the issue that the photons are point particles, and point particles are infinitesimally small. However much you bring your resolution, they will still be a point particle. And that's what we think is the reality around us. And I think your point is a brilliant one, because I've long been interested in traditional cultures, the way they have their belief systems, the shamanic worldview, the shamanic traveling. And I'd never thought about it the way you said it there, that they see the world, our consciousness is out there. The observation is everything. Now, I'm working on a hypothesis at the moment I call the egregorial model. And I'm arguing that we co-create reality from our expectations of reality. We collapse the wave function of the potentiality. The statistical wave function is collapsed by our anticipation of what is likely to be there. Yes. And I genuinely believe that if you start looking at the discovery of subatomic particles, you'll find the amount of times that scientists hypothesize about a subatomic particle and they find it. Like when the muon was discovered. It was extraordinary because the guy that was heading the team was a guy called E. Rabi, who was a Nobel Prize winner. And when they discovered the muon, he turned around and he said, "Who ordered that?" Because there was a collective anticipation that that object would be there. And this is why I believe we have the particle zoo. It's because we are co-creating reality, and our anticipations of reality co-create. And as you rightly say, if we start looking at the science, what quantum mechanics, what cosmology are both telling us about reality, we are much closer to, as Julian Jean said, the universe seems more like a great thought than a great machine.
Yeah.
And that's so accurate, isn't it?
This is, since you've told me this is an informal, we can just have stray random thoughts. My stray random thought is that I think the materialist model is that the brain creates consciousness. And what we're learning is that actually the brain creates the sense of time and space. And consciousness is independent of the brain. And I think that, what you said is a perfect illustration of that, is that like what you were saying is if there weren't objects, then we wouldn't have space. Well, because space is part of our mental model that we're creating, but it's like we have our current society has the world flipped around. We think that consciousness is dependent on the brain, and we think that time itself is somehow independent. And the theoretical physicists tell us that that is not so, that time and space are not fundamental properties of the universe at all. And that goes back to the whole issue then of what can leave the body when there really is no body. The information that is us is embedded in a greater electromagnetic field, which contains all the information that there is. And so, that's my stray thought from what you were talking about.
Well, I jump from that and I say, yeah, of course, and you're quite right, because of course, what did Einstein turn around? He said, time is an illusion, but it's a particularly persistent one. And we think that time, I when I wrote my book, The Labyrinth of Time, I felt like St. Augustine at the start, because St. Augustine once wrote, and he said, if I don't think about time, I think I understand it, and I think I know exactly what it is, until I start drilling into it. And then suddenly you realize that time is the most peculiar, counterintuitive. It's the framework that everything happens within. But if you start looking at time in the way the quantum physicists look, the way Minkowski with his concept of block time and the idea that we are existing in slices of time, then you have the work of people like Julian Barber, who's an English mathematician who in about 1999 wrote a book called The End of Time. And he again argues that time is a series of slices. Now, if time is quantized in the same way that matter is quantized, as David Finkelstein said, there will be a particle of time, which he jokingly called the chronon. And of course, the whole point of quantum mechanics is that it is quanta, it is little packages that are uniquely not associated with each other. So if at the lowest level of reality, matter and space are quantized, which we believe it is when we go down to the level of the Planck length, we know that that is when matter breaks down itself, when space breaks down. And there's bits in between these bits, and we don't know what they are. Then we have the mystery of dark energy, dark matter. 94% of the universe is missing. We call it dark matter because we don't know what it is.
Right.
Now, if that is the case, that means that effectively, and in one of my books, I use this argument, and I said, well, this means effectively that your brain itself is created out of subatomic particles. Your brain is made up of quarks, and then basically reality is just the 6 quarks in fields with electrons. And that's all there is. Everything is made from these point particles. But
let's now bring this to real life, to the clinical life. So that this doesn't sound like some sort of abstract theoretical discussion, which of course it is. First, when we talk about that dark energy and dark matter, it's not as if dark energy and dark matter are somewhere way across the universe. This is our little area of reality, and then there, 3/4 of the universe, is dark, just meaning that we can't see it, we can't perceive it. Is somewhere else. No, it's intermingled with us. It's all around us. So when people say, and it's also made of quarks and made of, the same subatomic particles that we're made of, but just with different spins, So when people say that they don't believe in angels, or, they don't believe in this or they don't believe in that, why not? I mean, we're not seeing 3/4 of the universe. But I want to go back to a comment that you made when you talked about how that at the moment of perception is when this probabilistic universe then collapses into what's real, or at least what's real to us. And I see this happen in medicine all the time. That this is the area which allows for the miracles in medicine, so to speak. When a disease had not yet been diagnosed, particularly in that point where we're trying to decide, is it a serious disease such as cancer? Is it a life-threatening disease, etc.? There's that moment when the answer isn't known yet, the tests aren't back yet, etc. And in previous eras, that was the moment then that the power of the mind could intervene, that a physician could say something like, I think this is going to have a good outcome. I feel really good about this, etc. And then, sure enough, that sense of certainty that there would be a good outcome in itself then creates a fertile environment in which, when everything is probability, when the person then decides and perceives exactly what they have, that's the moment that they can either collapse into something horrible, some terrible disease, or it can collapse into something that's benign. And this is the area of medicine that we all know exists. It's that they call it the placebo effect. They call it Sir William Osler, one of the first great physicians, used to say, be sure to use the new medicines as soon as possible while they still work, because of that sense, that the expectation that this new medicine was going to work, in fact, created it helped them to collapse perception into that it in fact did work. And Anthony, I have seen the opposite of this as well. I had a patient once who they went up to the University of Washington. The mother was pregnant, and they were told that their fetus did not have a brain. That this was anencephaly, and this was with the state-of-the-art ultrasound devices, etc. But for this patient, they chose to not believe it. They absolutely didn't believe it, and they took the attitude of, "What do doctors know?" Can you believe? Their attitude was, "Can you believe that we went to the University of Washington, where all those smart doctors are, and they told us that our baby didn't have a brain?" That's what they told me. And sure enough, when that baby was delivered, that baby had a brain. So, to me, this is the clinical application of the theoretical things that you're talking about. Now, I don't know how to harness this from in a practical standpoint. I don't know how we can tell people, well, just don't believe. Bad news. Probability, a remote one, that it's not cancerous. And yet what we perceive and what we decide to perceive clearly makes a difference. And there's, just dozens and dozens and dozens of well-designed, excellent medical studies that show this.
That is fascinating on so many different levels. I'm reminded, though, when you were talking about the person with no brain, or the child with potentially no brain, I'm reminded of the very famous case of John Lorber, a British surgeon who opened the skull of a young guy that had water on the brain. And he discovered that he had very little brain matter. Yeah. And the dura was around the edges. And this guy had got a degree in maths.
Yeah.
So clearly the idea that we need a brain in order to function, yes, of course, there is a relationship, and we know, but the map is not necessarily the territory. And again, people confuse the fact when we say, if we play around with certain parts of the brain, we know that a certain person will lose certain abilities. Well, yes, but we know the brain is a neuroplasticity. We know the brain can work in different pathways. And I'm always intrigued on this, the argument that consciousness is an epiphenomenon of brain function. So I've always used the argument to say, okay, so when does consciousness appear? Is it the addition of one molecule? Is it the addition of one atom? Is it the addition of one quark? When does the point, and does it move from complete nothingness to consciousness? This is a huge leap. As David Chalmers said, it's the hard problem of physics. We can do the easy problem of physics, how the neurology and how the neurochemistry of the brain works, but how, in effect, inanimate matter reacting with electricity creates Melvin, Morse, Anthony Peake, and all the people watching this is a mystery beyond words. And when Daniel Dennett says consciousness explained, talk about hubris. Come on, yeah. Come on. How vain can you possibly be? And there was another writer that did something similar about 4 or 5 years ago, whose name escapes me now. But we are not even at first point. Then we have the great, interesting, fascinating things that a lot of people are not. As you said earlier on, because I'm an enthusiastic layperson, I'm not restricted by where I go for my ideas.
Exactly.
I come across.
We have to go to so many different places to understand this phenomenon.
Yes.
Like I was just talking about earlier, you have to, go to cultural anthropology, understand how primitive, primitive peoples, what is their perception of reality?
Because there's no such thing as a Renaissance man or a Renaissance person anymore, because there's so many things we need to understand. And for instance, with things that have been missed over recent years, like, for instance, the biggest news, I think, in Western science took place in 1981 in Paris, when Alain Aspect, Jean Dalibard, and another guy got together at the Institute of Optics, and they proved Bell's inequality. This was something that, the Northern Irish CERN physicist in 1965-66 had taken the Einstein-Podolsky-Rosen experiment and said about non-locality. And they proved in 1981 the reality of non-locality. And since then, people like the Austrian guy, Anton Zeilinger, have been doing experiments with non-locality. And of course, Zeilinger and Aspect won last year. They won the Nobel Prize for Physics on this work. It should have been headlines around the world, and it isn't, for one very good reason. And the reason is something that was said by Rosenberg and Kuttner, two physicists at the University of California, wrote a book a few years ago called Science Encounters Consciousness. And when they said they were going to write this book, their associates at the university, their fellow physicists, said, you can't write this book. You can't allow the general public to be aware of the kind of things we're talking about now. The idea that non-locality is real, the idea that subatomic particles can be spread to the different sides of the universe, and once they're entangled, they can communicate instantaneously. They're fearful that the general public will make the general public just go crazy. But the fact of the matter is these are facts.
Yeah.
And to just pretend that they're not, is bad science, because we've got to then think, well, what does that tell us about how the brain works? Does the brain work on non-local ideas? And in one of my books, I argue that I think, and it's going to be interesting talking to you about this, that I think the brain, we are getting the neuron model is the wrong model. I think it's the glial network within the brain where the communication takes place. And of course, how science works, glial, German for glue. The idea was that 9/10 of the brain is just wasted because the glial cells are there to hold the neurons in place. Come on, nature doesn't do that. The glial cells are there for a reason. And I think there's something called, is it the calcium wave that grows across the brain under certain circumstances, which I think means it works non-locally. So I'm very much a fan of orchestrated objective reduction, the Hammerhoff and Penrose model. I think it works to a certain extent. And I think microtubules, fascinating structures, and I've linked microtubules in one of my books to the development of Alzheimer's and the destruction of microtubules. But that means that the microtubules can't communicate. And I think that the microtubules themselves are actually tiny creators of holograms, because of course they have single photon light coming from either side of the microtubules. There is light crossing, and when light crosses, it causes interference patterns. So if the tens of billions of microtubules in our brain are all singularly collecting, creating tiny holograms, is this what our reality processor is?
Okay, so let's bring this into real life. So local reality is the experience that we're having right now. So local reality, meaning that we're local, that I'm like a little person looking out of my eyes, and I'm actually communicating with you, and you're actually at a great distance from me in England. And that I can reach out and I can touch this laptop, and there's all these objects around me, and as I was talking about before, objects that we have sort of mutually agreed as to what they are, what their definitions are, what their meaning, their cultural meanings are, etc. That's local reality. And then non-local reality, which the kids that have had near-death experiences call, the really real. That's the reality that time and space doesn't exist. So that's the reality. We can understand, for example, the out-of-body experience if we're just talking about local reality, because, it's a model that we've created. But in non-local reality, since there is no space or time, our body isn't going anywhere. Instead, we're just simply returning to this understanding, as kids said to me, everything's happening all at once. People that have near-death experiences, they say that they suddenly understand everything, that all the information in the world suddenly makes sense, and they're perceiving it all at once. And so why would we have this system? What you ask people to have near-death experiences, which to me is the gold standard. We know that is the dying experience. So they're the ones who are the closest to whatever this non-local reality is, which seems to be imbued with its own consciousness and its own sense of unconditional love. And when we talk to them about it, they say, we're here to learn lessons of love. They say that actually this local reality that we all share is created for a very specific reason, and that's to learn specific lessons of love. And when you look at it from that standpoint, that rings true. I think that almost everybody that I talk to, particularly when they get to be our age, Anthony, we look back and we see that our lives were about lessons of love. That by and large, that does seem to ring true as to what this reality is all about. But this local reality, I think, is crafted for a specific reason, and that is for us to learn these lessons. Just sort of another comment I'd like to share with you is everything that you just went over, Anthony, is why I learned to remote view. Because if it's really true, these things are so counterintuitive because we're built on local reality. Although, as you point out, correctly, like the Max Planck Institute in Germany has documented that many aspects of the human brain are non-local, even things like color perception, etc. Theoretical physicists have even had fun analyzing a Major League Baseball player's ability to hit a fastball, and have speculated that that's a non-local reaction, that that the neurons cannot process information quickly enough to pick up the movement of a fastball. But as you say, maybe the neurons is maybe that's maybe that's not where it's happening anyway. It's hard to distinguish sometimes the signal for the noise, and maybe it's the patterns of firing. Maybe it's the 1/f fluctuations that are inherent in the discharge of neurons, or in glial cells, or the microtubules are also have these kinds of 1/f fluctuations. But all of this together, with kids telling me things like, "I suddenly understood everything," implied to me that this is a non-local informational universe. And if that's true, then we should be able to remote view. And remote viewing, of course, is the ability to perceive things, to receive information through non-ordinary means, not through any of your ordinary senses, but to somehow process information at a great distance, or, hidden from your senses or what have you. And I understand why the scientific literature has great resistance to remote viewing, even though even though it's well documented in various studies, even a study in Nature, for example. I understand that because it's counterintuitive. We think that all of our information has to come in through our eyes or through our ears. The idea that we could bring in information, just that it can just come into our head, because things like, I'm not as cynical as you about non-locality. I think that non-locality is just really hard to understand. I mean, the idea that we are all entangled. We all came from the singularity, the Big Bang, which is,
Yes.
So entanglement has to start from a mutually shared event. In the laboratory, of course, it's the creation of a beam of light, a laser beam, or something like that. But we all were created from the same event, so we all are entangled. But it's counterintuitive. It's not. It doesn't seem to make sense. From our local consciousness. So that is why, in fact, I learned to remote view. And
well, tell. I'm really interested now that you tried remote viewing. So can you tell me a little bit more about how you did that and what successes you had?
Remote viewing, I learned there's great studying near-death experiences in children because it just opened a lot of doors for me. And so I was able to learn remote viewing from the United States military remote viewers, who, well, they certainly have the intellectual discipline to remote view. And it takes a lot of intellectual discipline, because the problem always is discerning what information is your mind just making up versus what information is coming from a remote source. And they have, they have techniques in which they can use to understand this. They call it analytic overlay, meaning that, as information comes to you, of course, your mind tries to make sense of it. And so it's making up, extra information, etc. However, having the mental discipline to learn to, to create and learn to remote view, they use it for things like, remote viewing aircraft, remote viewing military equipment, things like that. Whereas obviously it's of an enormous spiritual importance. If we can truly remote view, that means that we can truly interact with, it's not just a theoretical matter of being entangled with everything in the universe, but that our consciousness can actually interact with that, and that we can process information from the universe. Well, so if remote viewing is real, well, mediumship, for example, is real. Mediumship is the same thing. That's just simply, accessing information, in that case, information about a person's personality and spirit, who, their body has died in this local reality. But of course, the information that is them still exists in non-local reality. Why would it ever disappear? So all right. So what is remote viewing? It's astonishing. What they do is, let's say, for example, our target is the Eiffel Tower. So then they'll take the Eiffel Tower, they meaning, the teachers, the military remote viewers who teach remote viewing, and they'll translate it into a 9-digit number. So you'll have, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And so then that will be associated psychically, with the information that is the Eiffel Tower, meaning all of the sensory impressions of it, etc. There's now an extra piece of information, sort of a psychic address, if you will. And then they'll take this number and they'll give it to the person who's trying to review it. And so that's what you start with, Anthony. You start with a number. And as you try to perceive this number, the information associated with the number, you basically are recreating ordinary perception, because you brilliantly outlined what is ordinary perception earlier. How information is translated into electrochemical impulses. And those electrochemical impulses come through different pathways through our brain, and then finally come to an area of our brain, as you point out, the darkest area of our brain, and a visual image, for example, is created. So that's what the process of remote viewing starts with. You start to get sensations of color. You start to get sensations of dimensions, lines, edges, textures, shapes. And as these information comes in, then you have to constantly battle against trying to make sense of it too soon. Because, as soon as some information comes in, you're going to immediately say, aha, so for example, if the information about the Eiffel Tower is coming into your brain, you might suddenly decide that it's the Space Needle in Seattle. So that's the analytic overlay. And so then you'll start to make up stuff. You'll start to say, oh, I hear the sea, or you'll start to bring in information about Seattle that you already know. And we do this in ordinary life, Anthony. I mean, we do this in our relationships with other people. We're constantly bringing in information, and then adding in analytic overlay, adding in our own opinion of what it is, and being too quick to make sense of it. So, the learning to remote view, I think, has helped me a lot in my relationships. It certainly has helped me in my relationship.
Did you ever have any examples where you had success with it, where you actually saw something target?
Oh my gosh, yes.
Yeah.
I would say, I would say remote viewing works. The remote viewing protocol works. I don't know. The first thing I ever remote viewed was a rock arch in Arches National Park in the United States. And so as I was getting sensory impressions, it was hot. It's it's dusty, reaching down, feeling the ground, feeling gritty, substances, etc. And so I started to then actually start to feel the shape of it. And so then my instructor said to me, so put your hand right here, in the center of the arch. And I put my hand there, and I couldn't feel anything. And I just I was so shocked. I was like, wait, because I was expecting, I wasn't expecting to feel nothing. So you don't really know. You're not able to ever put a name to it. You can only describe it. You can only, but you're describing, typically you end your remote viewing session with a 2-page description of, something that, it's huge, it's rough. You can draw, you can draw, you can end up drawing the arch. You can, you'll know that, all the sensories that are associated with it. But think about it. Names are, again, that comes from our local consciousness. That comes from our local reality. In non-local reality, nothing has names. In the informational universe, nothing has names. This is why, so there's many truths in the Bible. And one of my favorite one is that God told man to give everything a name, because that's our left temporal lobe. And that's the world giving us names. We talked a little bit before, about my book, Where God Lives. But now we're getting to the point where when we start to understand how our brain is connected to this universe, you can understand why you can't name anything in a remote viewing session, because we're connected to the universe with our right temporal lobe. And our right temporal lobe is nonverbal.
There's nonverbal areas. There's not Broca's area or Wernicke's area. There are there?
Yeah.
No.
Well, it's nonverbal. So we know, and we know this from split brain research. We know this from patients that usually it's because they have intractable seizures. So they have the 2 hemispheres of their brain severed. This gave physicians the opportunity to then study what happens, why do we have these 2 sections to our brain? And it turns out we actually have two separate streams of consciousness. And they precisely match local consciousness, which is our left brain, and non-local consciousness, which apparently is our right brain, which is, which is the part of our brain which doesn't understand patterns, doesn't have much pattern recognition, just has pure sensory input, doesn't seem to have a sense of time, doesn't seem to have a sense of place, and is completely nonverbal. We're not used to that area of the brain because we think that our sort of internal narrator is all there is. We think that that's our consciousness, but that's actually just a tiny part of our consciousness. And so, when you understand ordinary brain function, then you can understand, what happens with remote viewing, and, for example, why, it's hard for, this is why it's hard for the police to work with psychics, because police want the psychic to tell them, the body is hidden at this address, down the street. But that's not the process of remote viewing. You're getting information from non-local reality through your right brain non-local reality processor.
It's one of the things that, I occasionally experience hypnagogic and hypnopompic imagery. And, I can see the parallels there in that you always find that it almost needs to creep up on you. You've almost got to keep it metaphorically in your periphery vision. As you rightly say, I think your comment before, you've got to wait until all the information is there for the full picture to appear. And if you jump too quickly, in terms of hypnagogic imagery, you're going to lose it. Now, I've got a number of friends of mine who have out-of-the-body experiences. And I'd argue that a number of their out-of-body experiences could be argued to be remote viewing. And I know friends of mine that have visited other locations and have come back with information.
Because, as we said before, there is no body to be out of.
Yes, and this is the important thing, isn't it? That we talk about the out-of-body experience, and I more call it the intrasomatic experience.
Yes, I agree. Perfectly.
And I think that's a far more accurate, and it's very much the Charles McCrory model, and his associate, a lady whose name's escaped me, which is unfortunate. But for instance, one of the things that fascinated me when I was writing my book on the out-of-body experience, I did a lot of research into remote viewing and some of the work that they were doing at with Ingo Swann and Harare and various other people. And I was fascinated, for instance, Ingo Swann, when he identified the volcanoes on Jupiter.
Yeah.
He came in, and I was one of the ones that criticized him by saying there are no volcanoes on Jupiter and they would have to be ridiculously high. But then my knowledge of astronomy told me, however, that one of the moons, I think, of either Jupiter or Saturn, and I think it's Jupiter, is Io. And Io is the most volcanic object in the solar system. Now, imagine the scenario that, of course, that Ingo Swann just confused what he thought was the surface of Jupiter for Io.
Yes, of course.
And in which case, and again, because he hadn't got the full picture, he didn't get the opportunity to pull it all together. And whereas initially I was quite negative about it, the more I've learned about it, and the more, and talking to you now as well, is again, it's astonishing. It's putting things into place where I thought I was going with it. And I think, no, this is correct. We are misunderstanding, because of our brains and the way our brains are programmed, we're misunderstanding it. Now, for instance, your example of split brain operations, I've written extensively about split brain operations. And I always love the story of how the different hemispheres work. Was the case of PS that Sperry and Gazzaniga worked with. It was a young man who had a split brain, he had a commissatory, and he was sitting in front of a table, and there were a group of Scrabble cards next to him. And he was asked what he wanted to be when he grew up. And he verbalized and said he wanted to be a quantity surveyor. As he did so, his left hand grabbed a load of Scrabble cards and wrote automobile racer. Now, again, this is evidence of, as somebody then said, it means that it's like there is a part of us that's always been suppressed by this other personality that's dominant. The dominant hemisphere literally dominates and overpowers the non-verbal, non-dominant hemisphere. And this is what I'd love to now move on, because we're both fascinated by the role of the temporal lobes in this. And I first got into the role of temporal lobes by reading this book here, which you cite in your book, the Julian Jaynes book, but also the work of Ramachandran and his work with people, and Ramachandran and Oliver Sacks, with people who have temporal lobe epilepsy. Yeah. Now, I have a model I call the Huxleyan spectrum. And I argue that the doors of perception for most neurotypicals are closed. But then when you move along my Huxleyan spectrum, you get to classical migraine, which is what I have, where the doors of perception are slightly open. Then you get to the overlapping areas between classic migraine and temporal lobe epilepsy. And then the doors are wider again. And then they're blown wide open with schizophrenia. Then on top of this, you add into that scenario Alzheimer's, Gershwin syndrome, all these other syndromes that seem to link in. And it seems to all focus around the temporal lobes. It seems that the temporal lobes, particularly, as you say, the right temporal lobe, seems to be the God spot, as Ramachandran calls it. And of course, then we get to the getting it wrong again with modern science, work of Persinger and his God spot and the God helmet. This is not saying that it's opening up channels of communication that are ordinarily denied to everyday consciousness, isn't it? And for instance, there's somebody I must put you in touch with. There's a really good friend of mine called Myron Dial. And Myron is a Californian artist. And Myron has I never use the term even, probably experienced temporal lobe epilepsy since he was 4 years old. And when he was 4 years old, when he had his first temporal lobe experience, his personality split into two. And I call it the daemon eidolon dyad.
Yeah.
And his daemon, which is, I think, functions in the non-dominant hemisphere, is imminent in his life. And I would argue that the daemon is the equivalent of the being of light. within the Moody traits.
Well said. Yeah, that's very interesting. Well said. That's really, I think that's really interesting. That, you know, that, and that, so that internal consciousness, or what you're calling the being of light, it's, that may be then the consciousness that is inherent in non-local reality, the consciousness that people that have near-death experiences encounter at the point of death.
I call that consciousness, the non-local consciousness, in a new book you'll probably remember, I call it the Uberdaemon.
Yeah.
And that is the equivalent of the Jungian collective unconscious. It's a sentience that is outside of ourselves, that's part of ourselves. And then I extrapolate that to something I call the Godemon. And the Godemon is the equivalent of the Or Ein Sof that you get in the Kabbalah, or Brahman, the singular consciousness that is everything, the kind of the information field.
Okay, but before we get to this, first of all, this is going to give me my opportunity to tell you my first Vernon Nepi story.
Oh, come on, yes, let's just explain. We both are great fans of Vernon Nepi, so explain.
We need to explain, how do we know that the right temporal lobe is the God spot? How do we know this? Well, first, the work of Wilder Penfield. And Wilder Penfield is the American neurosurgeon who mapped out most of the brain, most of where, the areas of the brain that are involved with language. He would, back when they could do these kinds of fun studies, he would, take conscious patients that he was otherwise doing neurosurgical procedures on, and he would just, randomly stimulate areas of their brain. And, they stimulate the motor area, they'd move their arm, etc. Well, when he stimulated areas in the right temporal lobe, patients said things like, "Oh God, I'm leaving my body." Or even more intriguingly, they said things like, "I'm half in and I'm half out." So that's one huge piece of information. Another one is what you were talking about with temporal lobe seizures. Temporal lobe seizures have long been known to be associated with spirituality. It's just nobody has ever made the connection that that the right temporal lobe may actually be a conduit, to the spiritual universe, or the spiritual universe inherent in it, simply because. In the medical world, they just didn't believe that these patients were really seeing God. They just, the scientists.
This is very quickly my opportunity to quote you, because in your book, you say, "To date, no well-described attempt to identify the source of hunches or intuitions has been found." We'll come back to that later, because I'd argue my Damon Edelon model does exactly that. And again, I loved the Wilder Penfield experiences, and I remember particularly the lady that was catapulted back into her past. Do you remember? And she said, "That's my son Johnny calling me."
Yeah.
And then he took the electrode off, and then while she was distracted, put it back on again, and she was back in her kitchen again, which again, as Penfield said, suggests that everything we experience is recorded as well, and it's encoded within the temporal lobes, possibly. But I jumped in there,
or at least can be accessed through the temporal lobes.
Yes, it's more important. Access through. It's so important.
All right. So Vernon Nepi is he's a neuropsychiatrist at the University of Washington. He helped to design my study of children who had near-death experiences, and then what they were, the transformation, what they were like as adults. And Vernon Nepi helped me to design this study and influenced me in understanding the right temporal lobe. The right temporal lobe, one of its other functions is to process smell. And it processes a lot of sensory input, but particularly processes smells. And Vernon feels very strongly that when you start to have these intense odors, that it means that your right temporal lobe is working in a spiritual way. So here's his story. He said he went out to the coast of Washington State, and he went to a lighthouse there and met the lighthouse keeper. And they were talking about, and Vernon was very interested. What is it like to to live in a lighthouse and be a lighthouse keeper, etc. And the man said to him, it's very interesting. He said, and the one thing I really like is these wonderful smells. I'm always having just these fabulous smells. I smell wonderful flowers all the time. And Vernon looks around and he doesn't see any flowers. And so he immediately says to the man, so tell me about the dreams you have that come true. and the man gasps and said, how did you know? And, because that's a marker for the proper function of the right temporal lobe. And
Wow.
right temporal lobe seizures, may also may not be necessarily seizures at all. I think sometimes I'm sure they are seizures, but other times they may simply be the proper functioning of the right temporal lobe. And we perceive, we've just decided to label, spiritual experiences, encountering God, the type of experiences that you were talking about. We may have just decided to label those as pathological. We may decide to label them as, and yet they might be the proper functioning of the right temporal lobe.
Well, that's interesting, isn't it? Because I know that there was a famous book written by Ozzy Temkin on a book called The Falling Sickness. And of course, it's been known throughout the centuries as the diviner's disease. And I have actually witnessed, over the years, I've been contacted by a large number of people who experience temporal lobe epilepsy on the back of my writing, because I always feel that, these people aren't being listened to. They should listen to their experiences because they're actually telling you what's happening and they're not being listened to. And there was one lady who arranged to meet me when I was in Liverpool, where I used to my original home city. And she because now it was really interesting. She had the WADA test, and she was explaining to me when she had WADA, she sensed the other person in her head. When they deadened her dominant hemisphere, she sensed the other personality coming through, which in itself was fascinating. But she then told me, and she wanted to meet me. So her and her son traveled into the center of Liverpool, and she left her son in the center of Liverpool and got the bus out to see me because being an epileptic, she wasn't allowed to drive. So it's about 6 miles out of the city center. And I met her in a Borders bookstore. Now, the Borders bookstore was a very interesting one because it had a mezzanine floor at the back, which overlooked the store. So you sat at the back and there was a Costa's coffee shop. And I said, I'll see you in the Costa's coffee shop. So she comes in and she sits down and she's explaining to me that she's left her son in the town centre and she's going to go later back to pick him up with his friend. So she's talking to me and suddenly she goes into, I don't know what the correct term we can call it now, an absence seizure, maybe. I don't know. We used to call it petit mal, didn't we? Which is not the right thing now, but an absence seizure or whatever we like to call it. And she just stares at me. And I knew immediately because I've witnessed it before. So I knew it was just an absence seizure. And I was waiting for her to come to. And as she's looking at me, her head turns and she looks over the balustrade into the shop. And she goes, he shouldn't be here. Why is he here? That's ridiculous. He's too early. He should not be here. And then she shook her head and she looked at me, came to, and I was about to explain to her what she'd said. When she looks away from me, looks out through the front door as her son walked in, and she used exactly the same words. And that to me was absolute evidence of short-term precognition taking place during an absence seizure, during a temporal lobe seizure.
Yeah.
And also evidence of what, the idea of the specious present, the idea that the present, sometimes certain people can actually acquire immediate knowledge of the immediate future, which you touch upon in your books. Your book, you touch upon this kind of ability to see short-term future events.
Now, I'd like to flesh that out a little bit because, again, this is something that I think has important practical. I'm sort of playing. I'm translating everything you're saying, Anthony, into practical life. I was a practicing, did critical care medicine. This is very hands-on and practical. So, all right. So, what are the studies that show that we have at least short-term precognition? But I mean, why stop there? I mean, if they show that we have short-term precognition, I'm sure that we have long-term as well. All right. They're very interesting studies. One involves taking college students and showing them various pictures. And these pictures could either be very pleasant, a landscape, etc., or it could be a horrific car crash. And they essentially hook the students up to lie detector machines, but not for that purpose, but because they're measuring heart rate, they're measuring how much they're sweating, all of these, physiological responses. And what they found was that the students could anticipate when they were going to see some horrific picture because of changes in their heart rate or, the amount of sweat that they're producing, etc. But very frequently, they would have no conscious, what conscious meaning left brain internal narrator consciousness. They would have no consciousness of it. Well, because they're perceiving this, I'm sure, from their right temporal lobe, through their nonverbal hemisphere. And so, they couldn't verbalize it, but they could certainly feel it. So this brings up I've talked to many people who say, for example, they have a sense of dread while they're driving their car. Yeah. And they simply pull over and then discover that, there's a horrific car accident, down the road, that they may have been involved in if they had.
I think it's very interesting, this, isn't it? I'm just, sorry to be jumping in again, but that particular experiment is the Dean Radin and Dick Bierman, wasn't it? Yeah. The Radin-Bierman experiment. And I found that absolutely fascinating. And then I came across a paper that was quite interesting in that it was suggesting that there's a potential maybe explanation, which is called the gambler's fallacy, isn't there? And the idea that a gambler, when they're watching red and black coming up, if red comes up more and more, they fall into the conclusion that statistically the chance of the next one being black is much higher. But of course, the reality is it isn't, because it's a statistical function. Yeah. But the idea that if you are anticipating a horrible picture, the more pictures you have that are nice of fluffy kittens and things, there will be a point where you'll think the next one has to be, because the last 5 haven't been, and you'll build up, and your skin conductance will pick up that in some way. Now, I've never accepted that as an argument. In other words, that I would argue that just because you can explain something doing something else doesn't mean you've explained it. You've just used an analogy to explain something you can't explain. But I think that monitoring your immediate future is extraordinary. And I think the amount of people that have contacted me over that car crash feeling, something's going to go wrong, that feeling of visceral dread that you get.
These studies, though, have been replicated. They've also done studies, interestingly, of gamblers, that gamblers are somehow can anticipate either big wins or big losses and similar types of things. And then there's a scientist at Cornell. Is his name Bem?
Darrell Bem, yeah.
Bem, yeah. He's done a number of different types of these types of
which stuff. Are extraordinary. And he got such criticism unnecessarily. The criticism of Bem was absolutely outrageous. They criticized his credibility. They criticized the parameters of the experiments, but he proved it.
Yeah,
and it's the problem, isn't it, with science now? If it doesn't fit in with their scenario and it doesn't fit in with their model, and because it implies that their model is not complete, they just ignore it. It's the role of ignoring, isn't it? That it doesn't commute. It's their big argument, isn't it? If your ideas are true, all our physics is wrong. Well, all your physics might be wrong. It could be. Why? For instance, we know that the medieval schoolmen spent years, didn't they, calculating the epicycles of the outer planets to explain retrograde motion. Yeah. But they were wrong. Then
Yeah.
we had the peasants in 18th century France saying
Well,
stones fell out of the sky.
yeah. And they're like, nah,
And no, that can't happen.
you making that up. Well, they call it the Semmelweis effect. After the Viennese physician,
okay.
who, for your listeners, he had the outrageous idea that washing hands might prevent disease in childbirth. That maybe it isn't a good idea to cut up cadavers and then without washing your hands go and deliver babies. But he was only able to show this empirically. The microscope hadn't been invented yet. And so there was no, it seemed irrational. So I think that as in general, we tend to doubt anything, like remote viewing, that we don't have a current explanation for it. It's hard to accept pure observation. And yet science is supposed to be about observation.
Yeah.
Science is supposed to start with observation. And yet, as you point out, Semmelweis eventually, apparently, was driven mad by the fact that his fellow physicians would not accept his findings.
Well, it's the same, isn't it? It's the same scientists that will turn around and say, you have to work empirically. It has to be empirically proven. And the plural of anecdote is not proof. And yet those very same scientists are quite happy to accommodate fudges like the time of hyperinflation after the Big Bang, where they have this sudden period where the universe was expanding at thousands of times the speed of light. They don't explain how that mechanism can even begin to function, but they need that to happen in order to understand the observations that they have. Then you have the same scientists are quite happy to accept that we have virtual particles that come out from nowhere for a billionth of a second and go back into nowhere again. And that's perfectly acceptable, but they won't accept that somebody can be precognitive. It's just crazy, isn't it?
Yeah.
It was a crazy level of thinking. I am sure that future generations will look back at this period and will go, they hadn't got a clue. It was in plain sight, and they were denying a whole area of human experience that could tell them a new paradigm of science that was there in plain sight that they ignored. For instance, moving on to, to Vernon Neppe, 75% of humanity, at least in one stage in their life, will experience a déjà vu sensation, as Vernon has argued. And yet, the explanation supposedly of déjà vu is the 1961 Efron hypothesis, which is again to do with the right and left hemispheres of the brain and the visual fields processing a visual signal a split second before. Right. And that's still in books explaining it. And yet, about 10 years ago, researchers at the University of Leeds, a guy called Akira O'Connor, did a series of experiments of déjà senti, where people were having déjà sound sensations. They were blind people who would hear something and hear it again. Now, the pathways in the brain for hearing are completely different to the visual pathways, and they're processed differently. So the explanation of the Efron hypothesis, the visual hypothesis, the visual pathways theory is dead in the water, but it's still in the books. Because they can't accept, because that throws them right back. There are 72 different explanations for déjà vu, according to, and I can't think the researcher in one of the universities in the southern states of the United, Alan somebody or other, is it White? I can't remember now. Mine's one of them in his book. My hypothesis is one of them. But people like Vernon Neppe, who are willing to just look at the facts as they present themselves. Literal empiricism.
Well,
proper empiricism.
I was taught, when I was trained to have humility, and I'm very glad that I did, because as we were talking about before, when I was sharing with you how I got interested in near-death experiences, this was an observation. It was an observation, was real. And it defied everything that I'd been taught about neuroscience. And yet my professors used to say, half of what you think is true is not true. And the problem is that right now I can't tell you which half it is and which half it isn't. But I always kept that in mind. And I think that that's really important. This is now the time, though, to tell you my second Vernon Neppe story, because Vernon is also very eloquent about the limitations of scientific studies. And Vernon tells about his attempt to study what they call the mini Gellers. And these were teenage boys mostly who would see Uri Geller on TV and were convinced that they could do it too, that they could, bend things with their mind. And so Vernon did a study of these mini Gellers, and he had, of course, then had to design a study. And he took a piece, I believe is a piece of aluminum. I apologize, Vernon, if I'm not telling this story exactly right, but it's roughly right. And he put it in a vacuum, in a vacuum tube container, glass container. So you could see it, just as a strip of aluminum. And then he invited the mini Gellers in to try to bend it with their mind. But then, of course, he had to give a time period, you have to do it in such and such period of time, et cetera. And the mini Gellers all came in and they couldn't do it. And he had one, teenage boy who was just really distressed by this and really took affront, but I really could do it. You don't believe me, but it's true. I could do it. And so Vernon, allowed him more time and, really, worked with him. And sure enough, he couldn't do it. And then Vernon said, as soon as the young man left the room, the little piece of strip of metal curled itself into a huge curlicue.
Wow.
just like that. So, but his study of mini Gellers, would be considered to be negative. Within the parameters of the study, nobody was able to actually bend the piece of metal.
But this is where I think we come into one of the very interesting areas of my research and probably yours. It's the trickster element, the sheep and the goats. It's the idea that we're being played with somehow. That sometimes these effects seem to have a sense of humor almost, that they toy with us.
Sense of humor, absolutely.
Yeah. And I'm reminded here, of the wonderful story, because in your book, you mentioned something else that I'm fascinated by, synchronicity. And I have a term, I call it synchronodipity, where there's kind of synchronicities that actually help you along. But I'm reminded of that wonderful story of Wolfgang Pauli. And as you probably know, there was something called the Pauli effect, whereby if there was an experiment taking place, if Pauli was in the room, the quantum physicist Wolfgang Pauli of the Pauli exclusion principle, the experiment wouldn't work in one way or another. Yeah. He was just somebody that nothing would work. And there was a group of people doing an experiment somewhere in northern Germany, miles away from where Pauli lived and everything else. And the experiment wouldn't work one day. It just suddenly stopped working. And they jokingly turned around and said, "Oh, Wolfgang Pauli's spirit must be here." And they sent a message out, and Pauli sent a message back to say he was actually traveling through the local railway station in that town when the experiment went wrong. And this, of course, made Pauli fascinated by synchronicity. Absolutely. And of course, I think he was preoccupied, wasn't he, with the number 137, I think it was. And I don't know if you know this story. All through his life, he had this thing about 137. And when he died of cancer, when he was in the hospice, the room he died in was room 137. Yeah. And that sends a shiver up your spine. And you think, wheels within wheels here. And sometimes I don't know if there's a guy called John Keel, who was a writer on the UFO phenomenon. And Keel very much argued does there's a French writer as well whose name's just escaped me. But these guys argue that in many ways the phenomenon itself is almost playing with us sometimes. It seems to deliberately do silly things, as if it's trying to disguise in plain sight.
Pierre Jovanovich he's a French publisher now, but he was originally started as an investigative journalist, and he studied angels. And he, in his study of, as from an investigative journalist point of view, his conclusion about angels is that they're real, powerful, and very funny. And I really think that when something is humorous or odd or idiosyncratic is to me the hallmark of the spiritual experience.
Yes, it is, isn't it? It's the way something happens and you look for the joke. Something happens and you'll have a synchronicity. And of course, the synchronicity, according to Camera, who was the first guy that really came up with the concept, the rooted synchronicities, the statistician, you look for the joke. And then you get the joke again because there's a kind of a double joke in there and you go, ha, 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 I didn't see that, And the guy I'm thinking of here was actually Jacques Vallée, the guy that talks about the kind of the trickster elements in terms of this kind of thing.
Yeah.
And there is this kind of sense of fun sometimes, which I actually absolutely love. And it's happened to me so many times. And you've probably had the same experience, the library angel, you need a book. And there it is. Yeah. And it just comes into your world. I mean, when I was writing my first book, Is There Life After Death? The Extraordinary Science of What Happens When We Die, back in 1999 to 2000, 2001, the amount of times this happened, but the biggest joke ever, and this is a synchronicity that I can never, ever get my head round. I needed a copy of the book Man and Time by J.B. Priestley. I was doing research. I've now written a book on J.B. Priestley subsequently, but I needed this book Man on Time, which was published in 1964. Okay. Couldn't get one in my local library. So I took myself down to my local library in Horsham in West Sussex, and I put an order in for the book. So then the order goes in for the book, and I had to wait a few weeks, and the library contacted me and said, right, the book is now in. I then waited a few more days before I decided to go into town to pick the book up. I pick the book up and I bring it back home and I leave it in my study. I'm going to bed one night and the book's there. And I pick the book up. Now, I don't know if Jan, like you, but I need to be reading all the time. So I'm flicking through the pages of this book, and it has about 280 pages. I'm flicking it through at random, and I open it at a particular random page. And it's describing relativity and the way in which, about light, and how when you're looking at a star, you're looking at it as it was 100 years, 200 years ago, so many light years away. And J.B. Priestley's trying to explain this. And he gives up explaining it, and he says, "I'll put you over to a physicist." And he has a little quotation box, and the quotation box was taken from a book called "Physics for the Layman," Relativity for the Layperson, written by somebody called Coleman in 1957. So here am I reading this book at random, at a random page and everything. Coleman starts writing, and he said, "Imagine that on the night," and I think it's of the 17th of March, 2000, there is an explosion on the star Betelgeuse. And I turned around to my wife and I went, "What year is it?" And she said, "It's 2000. I said, "What month is it?" And her eyes roll in her head. And she goes, "It's March." And I said, "What day is it?" She said, "It's the 17th. And I said, "Can you tell me how, of all the dates in the whole of the universe, from the beginning of time, Coleman chose the very date that I was reading it, even to the time of day?" And you go, wow.
Okay, so let's tie this together from what we were talking about before. Because when we started this out, we were talking about that the essence of the universe is not local, not this local consciousness and the local mental model and creation that we all sort of co-create together, but it's non-local. so that independent of time and space, that it's all entangled, so that the farthest reaches of the universe are entangled with our subatomic particles, that the person that wrote that book is subatomic particles are entangled with yours. And we know from those who have near-death experiences that this universe is conscious, that it has a consciousness, and certainly it has a sense of love. That's this sense of unconditional love is clearly a fundamental property of the universe. Time isn't, apparently, but love is. So it would make sense if this sort of fundamental consciousness also has a sense of humor and thinks things are funny. And that would be then a mechanism of how this could populate itself and pop up in all sorts of unexpected ways, in our life as we live it.
And I loved your analogy, which is one I've used as well. The idea at the first femtosecond of the Big Bang, everything was part of the singularity and was therefore entangled immediately. One of the things I do want to talk about, we've got about 20 minutes now. One of the things in your book that I was really bouncing around with enthusiasm, saying, "My God, he's got it," was in your book. You come exactly the same conclusion I do regarding reincarnation and past life memories.
Yeah.
And the idea of people and children having memories of past lives, the work of I can't remember the guy that was the University of Virginia, Stevenson, and everything else. Yes, and can you just explain your model on that? Because it reflects my own very, very accurately.
Well, if we see that, everything is information, and we see that information exists eternally, then, and we see that consciousness is the fundamental part of the universe, then we're going to be living through brain after brain after brain. It's just going to be one brain after another, after another, after another. But the fundamental properties that that are us, that's going to be eternal. And interestingly enough, I found support in this from the arch skeptic Michael Shermer, who writes for Scientific American, and he delights in debunking anything to do with spirituality, etc. And yet I was reading one of his articles in Scientific American, and he was pointing out that personality is just a cluster of information. Well, if you start to say that personality is a cluster of information, then you're very close, if not right there, at saying that reincarnation is certainly possible. And if we're here to learn specific lessons of love in any given lifetime, then certainly it's not just possible, but it's necessary in order for our long-term spiritual development. And, why wouldn't we just continue to exist as a cluster of information, within the brain itself? Once you accept that the brain doesn't create consciousness, then it's like taking the blinders off, and it's suddenly starting to see, the universe in an entirely different way. And frankly, Anthony, we talked before about how scientists like to discard information that doesn't fit into their model. Once you get rid of this blinder of thinking that consciousness is created by the brain, once you get rid of that, well, then you can understand lots of things. You can understand, reincarnation. You can understand past life memories. You can understand after-death communications. You can understand, a whole host of well-documented human behaviors, which right now we just ignore. We just say, "Oh, they're crazy," or it's not scientific. Is that
Yeah, no, it's the idea, isn't it? Yeah, the idea that we're tuning into a field of consciousness, like a huge vast recording of every experience that human beings have ever had, and so when you're hypnotized and you hypnotize back to being a 17th century peasant in France, you are attuning back into that intelligence of that person. And that to me it makes so much sense. And the idea that we feel ourselves as being individuated because our ego tells us that we're individuated, whereas in point of fact, again, if we do the argument, we're one single consciousness experiencing itself subjectively, then suddenly it all makes more sense. And I know that you cite, and I've cited in my books, the evidence of cryptomnesia as well in a lot of these cases where, people, we know that there's so much our brains hold in terms of information, that just because our dominant hemisphere cannot access that information field, it doesn't mean that our non-dominant hemisphere cannot subliminally access that information and bring it forward during hypnotic states and deep hypnosis states.
To add here, what we've learned from both split brain studies and from remote viewing, which is that also, in addition to true cryptomnesia, also, particularly our left hemisphere, just makes stuff up. In fact,
yes.
The brain really doesn't like to say, I don't know. It's unusual. That's the striking part about the child's near-death experience, is how readily and freely they say, I don't know. Because that's not a typical thing for, the left brain likes to tell a story, and it likes it to be a coherent story that makes sense. But just because that's true, then, it doesn't mean that, like in remote viewing, you can get real information from remote viewing, but you can also take bits of information and then create, invent stories from that information that are not true. And I'm sure the same thing is true with understanding past lives. I think
that's a good point, isn't it? Because if you use,
but just because lots of people seem to think that they were an Egyptian pharaoh, and not very many people seem to think they were Egyptian slaves, well, that's the left brain. That's the left brain, muddying the waters. But that,
I suppose, it's the issue, isn't it, of confabulation and the way in which, for instance, the J.W. Dunn work on precognitive dreaming. And the idea there, that we have precognitive dreams every night, but of course the brain confabulates the information that they're going to get we're going to receive in the future, and creates a scenario around it, like putting it in cotton wool, almost to explain the circumstances. And you have to dig in.
The confabulations come from our own fears and anxieties. And so that's, I think, often the difficulty that we have, is sorting out what is true spiritual information, what is true intuition, and then what is born of our own fears and anxieties. I saw this when I worked with split brain patients, in which we would put water on their hand, on the non-dominant hand. So the left brain wouldn't understand why there was water on its hand. And we would ask the person, we'd say, why do you have water on your hand? And many times they'd say things like, that bitch of a nurse, she hated me, so she just threw water on me. It was really interesting to hear all the different types of explanations. And they all were born, other people is very benign, oh, I don't know, maybe somebody spilled water on me, Now, I wanted to share with you a shaman that I worked with, and I taught him remote viewing because I think it had a bearing on this. This was a shaman who he did a lot of out-of-body explorations, and he was an urban planner as his day job, and then worked as a spiritual shaman, worked with people on things like soul retrieval and such as that. So I taught him to remote view, and I gave him as a target a man who would go to a stream in Asheville, North Carolina, every year, and he brought flowers to memorialize his wife's death, because this was an area that his wife and he would frequently hike. So that was the target I gave him. I gave him the target of these flowers in this stream. And the shaman correctly identified all the sensories to do with the flowers, and heard the rippling of the stream, and heard all the, clearly was right there at the site. Saw these flowers, heard the stream, the babblings of the brook, the shiny stones, the water. And then he encountered the grief. And then he immediately left his physical body, and in sort of in a shamanistic way, and went to an area in Detroit which was completely urban, destroyed, buildings which were no longer inhabited, and all this type of urban decay. And this was the value then of adding remote viewing to his shamanistic experiences, because see, with a remote viewing, you have a target that's known. So then I was able to show him the target, and so then he understood. Oh, I got everything right. I sensed the grief, but for me as an urban planner, grief and a destroyed, burnt out inner city are the same thing. And so that's what I added into the component. And I think that's really important to understand, because when I hear people talk about near-death experiences, they're too often ready to discount everything because of some cultural contamination. Because many people see Jesus as part of their near-death experience. For other people, that means, well, wait a minute, I don't believe in Jesus, so near-death experiences must not be real. Instead of just seeing it as everybody interprets spiritual experiences differently, and there's lots of analytic overlay.
Absolutely, and I think your point there is an incredibly powerful one. That it's going back almost to what we were discussing right at the start, isn't it? That in order to understand these phenomena, we have to just take them at face value and, interpret them as best we can, but dig deeper. What's the meaning for them? What do they signify? And to me, that's the great challenge. And it's not, and people like you and I, as we said earlier on, we're the people in the middle of the bridge with everybody throwing stones at us. But I think the future is going to be ours. And I think the future will be ours if we can get through this, because we're open-minded, but not open-minded enough that our brains fall out.
That's Carl.
And I think, and that is a powerfully important.
I agree that because we're at a time of paradigm shift. And so, people, are clinging to the old paradigm. I want to go back before we finish, Anthony. I want to go back to our discussion of synchronicity, and the humor in the universe, et cetera, because this again is not a theoretical discussion. It's the theoretical aspects of it, which I think are very important for people to understand, because there's lots of coincidences and synchronicities involved with the grieving process. After, in my case, it's my patients were children, so parents have these perceptions, and they will often doubt them because they seem coincidental. A Christmas cactus that used to bloom, at the end of November, and now suddenly starts blooming on the date of the anniversary of their child's death. That kind of thing. I don't see those as any different than these synchronicities. I think that maybe this conscious spirit that pervades our universe may be playful in one arena, but may be trying to share something important in another arena. And I want when people encounter these types of coincidences, they should take them seriously. I don't see them as any different than these synchronistic experiences, which we know are real. These are harder, of course, to document as being real. It's easy to just dismiss them. I had a patient once. She unfortunately died of leukemia, and she had wanted to go see The Lion King with her parents, as one of these things to do, before she passed. But unfortunately, she wasn't able to. The parents were then stuck with, should we go see The Lion King anyway? And they decided at the last minute, they decided that they would. And at the very last minute, when they got down to in the auditorium, a parking place immediately opened up for them, coincidentally, so that they could get in there on time. And I think it's realistic that's this, whatever the process is, working through entanglement and consciousness and our mental image of reality that we all co-create and share. I think that those types of coincidences are just as meaningful.
I think it's absolutely beautiful. And I think that just really is the perfect ending to a fascinating discussion.
Thank you.
And to say I've thoroughly enjoyed the last 2 hours is an understatement. It has been extraordinary. And I know that people will look back on this particular discussion and will find it, I hope, interesting. Everybody will interpret it in different ways. As we've said, everybody interprets their own world. As Charles Stewart Pearce, your great American philosopher, said, we all exist within our own phanerons. But I hope that our phanerons have touched your phanerons listening here, or indeed the people who will be watching this subsequently when the recording goes up. Please check out Melvin's work. And I think, one of the things that I think I find the most moving is the work you've done over the years with dying children. And that must be probably the most sad, but also wonderfully rewarding feeling that anybody can have, And as a physician, it must be heart-rendingly sad, but also enlightening, because you see the courage of these children that are facing, it's so sad. So, Melvin, thank you very much. That was absolutely wonderful. Again, finally, if anybody needs to contact you, your website and everything else as well, because I know there'll be people who have watched this one but won't have watched yesterday's and vice versa. So you can, again, where you can be contacted.
My name's Melvin Morse. That's Morse, like Morse code. So it's melvinmorsemd.com. And please contact me. I love this type of dialogue. I've tried to flesh out this on my website, interviews with children, pictures that they've drawn, but also trying to talk about the neuroscience of spirituality, and for people to understand that actually science is not against spirituality. The great reunion of science and spirituality, to me, is at hand, is this new paradigm. And if you understand modern neuroscience, you'll understand how to use your brain in a spiritual manner.
Wonderful, wonderful. And again, one of the books that I meant to mention earlier on that's well worth reading on is the Mario Beauregard, The Spiritual Brain.
Yes, yeah.
Excellent.
And I feel so great about that book, Anthony, because I wrote Where God Lives back in 2004, 2005. And there, Roger Nelson wrote The Spiritual Doorway to the Brain, which basically acknowledged that the brain is a spiritual organ. He doesn't happen to believe, in spirituality, but nevertheless, he doesn't in any way dispute the fundamental findings that we presented. And then Mario Beauregard comes along and says, wait a minute, it's not a God spot. He's got it all wrong. It's a God brain. Yeah, and that has really been the only response from the scientific community. There has been no response saying, that the brain is not spiritual. That's for sure. The only response has been someone like Dr. Beauregard coming along and saying, no, he's got it all wrong. 1/3 of the human brain is spiritually hardwired to interact with God.
Wonderful. I think that is the perfect ending. Right. Thanks very much. Wonderful to talk to you. We will be chatting in the future. That I'm absolutely sure. It's just the start of a great friendship. It's the start of a friendship. This.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Then all the best. Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.